What is American foreign policy going to look like in 50 years? 50 years. This is most of a lifetime. But it's most likely not going to be beyond your lifetime. Somebody who is 18, 20 years old today is statistically has something like a 90 or 95% chance of being alive 50 years from now. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that you're going to be able to check me on 50 years from now. And I'll add something here, and that is, this is something that I say to my history students all the time. If you are unhappy with the present, I say this to my 18, 20-year-old students, if you are unhappy with the present, then you can blame me. You can blame people of my generation. We created this world that you are moving into as adults. But the world of 50 years from now, if you don't like that, you have only yourselves to blame. You collectively are going to create the world of the next 50 years. This is one of the reasons you're taking this class. This is one of the reasons at the University of Texas students are required to take 2 semesters of American history. It's a good idea to know something about the past in order to chart the future, because you are citizens. You are the ones who are going to be creating that future. So, what is it going to look like? What is the world going to look like in 50 years? What is American foreign policy going to look like in 50 years? And the two are very closely related to each other, because what the world looks like is going to have a large influence on what American foreign policy is, and to some degree, to a lesser degree, vice versa. The United States for the last 75 years has been in a position to shape much of the world. It's unlikely that the United States is going to be shaping the world as much in the next 50 years as it has, let's say, in the last 50. But the United States is a big power, and what the United States does will have an influence on what the world becomes. Anyway, any honest person saying, being asked to predict what the world's going to look like in 50 years is going to say, I have no idea. Well, I have better than no idea. But all sorts of things could happen, as I've mentioned in the last lecture. There's a rule of thumb: the farther you get from the present, the more the bounds of uncertainty expand, until that 50 years out, the world could really look a whole lot different than it does today. And here's the thing. So in the 10-year period that we talked about last time, in 10 years it's unlikely that something is going to come along and utterly change the way the world works, utterly change relations among people. And therefore, you can, or to put it another way, the world has sufficient momentum that 10 years from now, a lot of that is just baked into where the world is today and the direction it's going. But in 50 years, some new technology could come along. Some new virus could come along. Something that we just don't anticipate. It's not inconceivable, pretty unlikely I think, but it's not inconceivable that the United States could be visited by creatures from another planet. And, who knows? But anyway, and my point is that you can, if a small change is made, let's say 5 years from now, a small change 5 years from now isn't going to have a huge impact 10 years from now. But a small change made 5 years from now could have a huge impact 50 years from now, sort of the compounding of interest, that sort of principle, exponential change. It goes way off the track the farther away you get. So rather than just throw up my hands, though, and say, I have no idea what the world's going to look like, I'm going to do this exercise by looking backwards. This, of course, is what historians do. And I want to sort of start at the beginning of American foreign policy and work our way toward the present in 50-year increments. So let's jump all the way back to 1770. So 250 years ago. And what did the world look like, and what did American foreign policy look like in 1770? Well, in 1770, the American colonies were still part of the British Empire, and the United States wasn't the United States, and it had no independent foreign policy. The foreign policy of Americans, such as it was the policy of the British Empire. But in 1770, the strains on the British Empire were sufficiently great that it was quite possible to imagine that the United States would not remain part of the British Empire forever. It was quite a minority view in 1770 that the United States should become independent. But within just a few years, it became a majority opinion in the United States. So in 1770, the United States has no foreign policy, or such as it is subservient to that of the British Empire. And in 1770, the British Empire was one of the great empires of the world. And it seemed to be on a rising trajectory. So the British Empire was going to be a big player for a while in world affairs. The United States or the American colonies, well, even if they did become independent, they would be a very small player in world affairs. There were other empires in the world. The Spanish Empire, it was declining, was still a big deal. The French Empire, the French had suffered a blow from the British and the Americans in the French and Indian War, but they were going to gain an edge once the American Revolutionary War brought France into it. And in fact, in about 20, 30 years, Napoleon would arise and make France the great power of Europe. So anyway, 1770. Now we'll jump forward to 1820, and let's see sort of how much change happened in that 50-year period for the United States. Well, a huge change for the United States, because there is a United States. There wasn't a United States in 1770, but by 1820 there was a United States, which raises a question. Let's say from 2020 to 2070, is the United States still going to be the same United States 50 years from now that it is today? Is it going to be bigger? Is it going to be smaller? One argument for bigger is, well, the United States might go from its free trade agreement, essentially, with Canada and Mexico, into a greater United States of America, of North America. So it can include Canada. Canada could become a member of the United States, and the Canadian provinces could become states of the United States. In Mexico, the states of Mexico could become states of the United States. Maybe adjusted for sort of the differences. So maybe there would be something like a European Union for North America. Call it a North American Union. And so the United States would become part of this bigger entity. In the reverse direction, maybe an equivalent of Brexit would set in. Or maybe if you wanted to go back farther in American history, something like the secession of 11 southern states in 1860 and 1861. So what, for example, if, let's just say, the Republican Party continues to be overrepresented in the Senate and the Electoral College, and Joe Biden wins in 2020, but what if the Republicans reassert their majority and they retain hold on the Senate, they get the presidency back? What if Republican appointed judges continue to interpret the Constitution? And what if liberal states like California and Oregon and Washington, what if they decide, enough is this, we can't live in this. This is the decision that the states that joined the Confederacy made in the early 1860s. What if California, which, if it were an independent country, would be the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, and throw in Oregon and Washington, which is the home of Amazon and Microsoft, then you'd have a viable country. What if the Pacific coast decided to leave the United States? Would there be a civil war? Would people in Texas fight to keep the left coast in? Or would they just say, go, just the way the European Union is saying to Britain, we think it's a bad idea that you're leaving, but you decided so, away you go. And by the way, so as Britain decides to leave the EU, there are people in Scotland who think Scotland ought to leave Britain, and maybe that'll happen, and maybe Scotland will then become an independent country and join the EU. So it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility in the next 50 years that the map of North America could change dramatically. The United States could get bigger, the United States could get smaller. And if that's the case, well, it would mirror what had happened in the period from 1770 to 1820. And in that 50-year period, a new country was created, and it started out with 13 colonies that became states, but then it kept adding states. It expanded across North America. By 1820, it went all the way to the crest of the Rocky Mountains. In another 40 years, it would go to the Pacific. So now, I should add something here. There's probably not going to be anything like the geographic expansion of countries in the 19th century. So the United States isn't going to expand. There aren't going to be Americans who move into Canada and settle, or move into Mexico and settle. I'm not going to say that the world is filled up, but in a post-agricultural world economy, obviously there are farmers, but agriculture isn't what most people do. That was the case in the early 19th century, and so to become more powerful, to have a bigger economy, to get the equivalent of more jobs, you had to have more land. So landed expansion was a big deal until the Industrial Revolution. So landed expansion is no longer such a big deal. There aren't the battles over territory the way there were before the Industrial Revolution. This is not to say that sometimes countries don't fight over borders, but it's not quite the top item on the agenda that it was. So anyway, So 1770 to 1820 points out that political organizations, political entities can change. And this certainly could be the case between 2020 and 2070. And if it's not just the United States, the EU could bulk up. The EU could become the equivalent of the United States of Europe. It could have a stronger central government, and the different European countries, members of the EU, could become like states of the United States. I should point out that in 1820, the federal government of the United States was quite weak, and the states were very much stronger. That's where the EU is now. But over time, the national government of the United States, the central government of the United States, became much more powerful, and the states became comparatively less powerful. There's a centralizing tendency in a lot of things, and this could happen. So the EU could become, we'll call it a United States of Europe. Right now it's comparable in size, and bigger in population, slightly bigger in economy, maybe not when you subtract out Britain, but it's comparable to the United States. So it could become a United States of Europe. We could have this really big country of Europe, which had been all these competing countries, could now become a single country, and it could become a huge player in world affairs. So that's a possibility. So go from 1820 to 1870 in American history and sort of in the history of the world. And what changed there? Well, a big change was the emergence of democracy in the United States. The United States was not a democracy. It was moving in that direction by 1820. But the idea that ordinary people could actually exercise political power and make responsible decisions, this was a minority view. And the United States was the only practicing, or even about to practice, democracy in the world on a large scale. There had been Athenian city-states that practiced very limited democracy, and Switzerland kind of had democracy at the level of the cantons, but in terms of this idea of democracy, that ordinary people should actually exercise political power, the United States was the pioneer. And the big steps occurred between 1820 and 1870, starting with universal suffrage, that is the vote, for first adult white males. Which is, not all the population by any means, but it was a big step forward. Before that, in 1770, ordinary, poor, relatively poor, or non-landed, non-wealthy, even white people couldn't vote in most places. So this was a big step forward toward, call it political equality, political participation. And a test of this occurred in the United States in the Civil War, because a lot of political theorists had thought that democracies were unstable, and they couldn't hold themselves together. And when the South seceded in 1860 and 61, it seemed to prove the truth of this theory or this prediction. And think about it. The United States really didn't embrace democracy till about 1825, 1830. And then 30 or 35 years later, the country seems to be blowing apart. And so it looked like democracy was not a good model going forward. But Abraham Lincoln decided the South should not be allowed to secede. And in some cases sort of overriding the Constitution or expanding his prerogatives under the Constitution, Lincoln insisted that the country hold together. And it did. And so the lesson here was that democracy could indeed exercise sufficient internal power to keep from flying apart. And as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, the point of the war by this time was to see whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that is democracy, should perish from the earth. And he wanted to make sure that it did not perish, and it did not perish. And in fact, the success of the Union in the Civil War signaled to other countries that democracy was viable, that you could have a democratic form of government and your country wouldn't dissolve into anarchy. And moving into the 20th century, democracy became this model for more and more countries. So a big question going forward from 2020 to 2070 is democracy going to remain the default setting for governments? In just a rough timeline, in 1800, I'm going to shift the jumps here a little bit, and you'll see why. In 1800, there weren't any democracies in the world. Leave aside the exception maybe of Switzerland, but the United States wasn't a democracy yet. No large countries were democracies. In 1900, how many democracies in the world? Well, the United States, arguably, Britain, sort of, France. So there might have been 5 or 6. And if you include some small countries, maybe a few more. Countries in Latin America, many of them had the trappings of democracy, but they didn't always follow through. So democracy was still a minority opinion, a minority position among world powers in 1900. By 2000, jump another 100 years ahead, democracy was the way 120 countries, so we got a tenfold increase. I mean, basically a tenfold increase from 1800 to 1900, another tenfold increase from 1900 to 2000. So most of the countries of the world were democracy. So it looked like democracy was on a roll. In fact, it looked like democracy was inevitable. This was the way the world was going to evolve. Kind of like the second law of thermodynamics, we're all moving in the direction of entropy, except the world was moving in the direction of democracy. But then things began to shift into reverse gear in the early part of the 21st century, partly with the rise of China, which stoutly resisted becoming a democracy. It had been a prediction of political theorists, had been a hope of American policymakers, that as China became wealthy, China would become freer and more democratic. But in fact, China didn't, and the government of China under Xi Jinping, the president in 2020, was less democratic than it had been before. It had never been really democratic, but there was much more centralized and much more of an authoritarian rule by the Communist Party. So, and democracy was having trouble in other countries, and people even began to look at the United States. And when President Trump challenged the veracity of elections, even ahead of the election of 2020, and complaining that it was going to be a fraud and the mail-in ballots were going to be stolen and all this stuff, and not accepting the victory of Joe Biden, this seemed to strike a blow at the basic principle of democracy. The government of the United States no longer stood up stoutly for democracies and democratic principles around the world. And so countries that had kind of been democracies, Russia, had been moving in the direction of democracy after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, but Vladimir Putin was firmly in charge in the 2010s, up into 2020. So maybe democracy wasn't inevitable. In 2070, what was the world going to look like? Was democracy going to hold on? Was there going to be a renaissance of democracy? So democracy would continue on its upward climb that it had been through the 20th century? Or would it turn out that the blossoming of democracy in the late 20th century was just this one-time thing? And democracy maybe turned out to be as unstable, as unsatisfactory as the opponents of democracy had predicted when the United States was about the only democracy in the world. So this would have a big impact on the way Americans looked at the world. Let's just assume, and I have some confidence in this, but I can't be totally sure, let's assume the United States remains a democracy in 2070. But if the United States, a democracy, is a lonely democracy in the year 2070, it's going to have a much harder time dealing with the world than if most of the world is democratic. It's demonstrably true that democracies have an easier time getting along with each other than they have getting along with dictatorships. In part because they share certain values, they share a general approach to the world and expectations of the relationship of government to the people and so on. Related to this is the concept of human rights. So, in 1770, starting at the beginning, in the 1770, human rights essentially did not exist. Even the concept hardly existed. And Thomas Jefferson, 6 years later, in the Declaration of Independence, would say that all men are created equal, one, and that they have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that was a minority opinion at the time, and he was really asserting this thing that wasn't true. And he would hope that the world was coming to this. And so, but over the course of the next 100 years, 150 years, almost 200 years, the concept of human rights caught on. And human rights, the idea that humans, by being human, merely by being born a human on the earth, you have certain rights. This was utterly foreign to people in the 18th century. And this is why most people who looked at the institution of slavery just kind of yawned this wasn't a big deal because, slaves are slaves. And people don't have a right to be free. People don't have a right to education. They don't have a right to this. These rights had to be invented and then enforced and developed over time. Maybe the high tide of human rights came in 1948, all the way down to 1948, when the United Nations passed what it called its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it included the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but they also added in things like a right to an education, a right to some degree of equality economically, and so on. And these, it looked like the world was moving in the direction of honoring human rights. But with the backsliding in the early 21st century, again, China imposing its will, first on the Chinese people, the Communist Party imposing its will on the Chinese people, and then absorbing Hong Kong and imposing the Chinese model on Hong Kong, maybe shortly taking over Taiwan. So it was no guarantee at all that human rights would be more widely enjoyed in 2070. Maybe they would go the way of democracy. If democracy became this minority opinion again, this concept of humans as having rights, are you kidding me? No. Rights are those things that maybe adhere to citizens of a particular country. So maybe Americans could say within the United States, the First Amendment applies, but the First Amendment of the United States Constitution does not apply to people living in Africa or in Asia or in South America. And so maybe people say, yeah, we were too hopeful. And it was just utterly unrealistic to think in terms of human rights. Okay, that's 1870. Between 1870 and 1920, perhaps the world changed more during that period than at any other time. And that was, the world went through the Industrial Revolution. The United States was kind of at the leading edge of the Industrial Revolution. Arguably, Britain was ahead of the United States. Germany was close, but a little bit behind. But much of the rest of the world underwent the Industrial Revolution. And this changed, I was about to say it changed everything. Nothing changes everything. But what it did do was make the United States it made the United States into the most powerful economy in the world, and therefore potentially the most powerful country in the world. I've said it before, I'll say it again, that sooner or later countries get the foreign policies they can afford. So by 1920, the United States could afford the most ambitious foreign policy in the world. But the sooner or later part kicked in here, and although Woodrow Wilson had proposed that the United States take a leading role in a world government, the League of Nations, the American people, or more precisely, an operating, blocking 1/3 of the U.S. Senate plus a little bit more, said that no, the United States would not sign the Treaty of Versailles, would not join the League of Nations. So the United States did not take that leading role in 1920. It took a little bit longer. But still, by 1920, the United States was in a position that it could dominate world affairs if it wanted to. Okay, from 1920 to 1970, this is when the United States does dominate world affairs. The United States is kind of slow getting into World War II, but once it goes in, it's really clear that the United States is going to run the table. The United States is going to, the side that the United States is on is going to win World War II. And the United States is going to come out of World War II by far the most powerful country and the country with the most ambitious foreign policy in the world. In fact, the most ambitious foreign policy in world history. So the United States remade the international order at the end of World War II and made it so it was dependent on the dollar. And so the dollar became the international currency. It became the international reserve currency. Here I'll mention something. The United States, the economies, the currencies of the world were pegged to the U.S. dollar. And so their value is determined by what they could buy and sell, what they were worth in terms of dollars. And these are fixed rates. And this persisted from 1945. Broke down in the early 1970s, but still in 2020. So if we go from 1970 to 2020, the dollar in 1920 is still the most important single currency in the world. But it's not as important as it was back in 1970. In 1970, the dollar was the international currency. Now there are alternatives. And this because the United States does not dominate the world economy the way it did during the early years after World War II. In 1945, the industrial gross domestic product of the United States equaled that of the rest of the world combined. So here's the world, here's the United States, they're equal. By 2020, the rest of the world, the United States is down to about 20% of the world economy. And China's is climbing, the EU's is climbing. So the dollar still holding on to its primacy in 2020. Would the dollar be the world's fallback currency in 2070? That's a hard one to believe. It's hard to answer that one yes, because the world was changing, China was getting larger. There's an advantage to having your currency, the currency that other countries trade in. And China would probably try to make use of that. It's possible that the EU, if it really pulled itself together into a single country, could put forward the euro as this international currency. But by 2020, it was really clear, especially after the efforts of the Trump administration to wage economic war against other countries, and to use economic sanctions against other countries, sanctions that bit because those other countries relied on the dollar. In this case, the Trump administration's efforts had the perverse counter effect of weakening the dollar because countries immediately began to look for alternatives to the dollar. And it seems quite likely to me that by 2070 there will be alternatives to the dollar. There might be a world currency, and it might be a digital currency. Maybe Bitcoin will become the world currency. Or it might be that the currency of China takes the place of the United States. But the prominence of the dollar, the dominance of the dollar has been declining since 1945. It declined a little bit in the early 1970s when the U.S. was forced to go off gold. It declined even more down to 2020 as the rise of China. I would be surprised if the U.S. dollar is the dominant currency. And if that's the case, then a big prop of American world leadership is gone. Okay, so that's 1970. Go from 1970 to 2020. 1970 to 2020. Well, this is the era of globalization, and globalization really ties the world together in a way that had never been tied together before. In the last part of that 5-decade period, in the 2010s, there was a backlash against globalization, as a lot of people thought, and a lot of people in countries like the United States said, we don't like being dependent on foreign countries, we don't like seeing our jobs go to countries where the wage rate is lower. We would like to reclaim some of our own economic autonomy. And so economic nationalism as opposed to economic internationalism set in, and the Trump administration appealed to this and waged tariff wars against China and other countries and adopted the policy of make America great again, and thinking of that in nationalist terms, America first, other countries second, or even farther down than that. So but nonetheless, the world was really knit together by communications, by transportation, by all sorts of things, by the economy, still in 2020 in a way that it was not in 1970. So a big question for 2070, for 50 years down the road, is globalization something that you can reverse? Do you and will people still want to reverse this? For years I've asked a question of students in my classes, and you might consider the answer to the question right now. Can you identify an article of clothing, you're wearing at the moment that was made in the United States? And if I'd asked the question in 1950, the answer would be, of course, yes. In fact, people then would have had a hard time identifying an item of clothing that was not made in the United States. By 2000, it was the answer that I was getting as well. So in a large class, let's say if I have a class of 400 students, maybe 2 or 3 students would raise their hand. And I asked them sort of how they knew that, because they made a deliberate effort, not on economic grounds, but sort of on America First grounds, that they wanted to buy American. And so there are big advantages. There's a big appeal of globalization because you get stuff at lower prices, higher quality at lower prices than you would if you had to make it all yourself. And that appeal is still going to exist. Now, will it be overridden by political considerations? It was in the 1930s. To some degree, it has been under President Trump. Will this be the model going forward, or will globalization continue? There are, as I say, there are great economic advantages in it, so there's a big economic incentive to continue it. But there's no telling exactly where that'll go. So that's from 1970 to 2020. Other things, the technology of communications changed dramatically between 1970 and 2020. There was no internet in 1970. There were no smartphones. None of this stuff that people take for granted. Now, this is a real wild card in all of this. In 1970, no one could have really predicted something like the smartphone. People had a vague notion of an internet. There were connected computers then, but no one had any idea it would become as ubiquitous as it did. So we don't know what the technology of 2070 will look like. And this is where we'd be just guessing. And so, it might knit the world closer together. Who knows, by 2070, humans might be colonizing Mars. So it may be that foreign policy is no longer just terrestrial foreign policy. Maybe there's a solar system policy, and maybe that will require greater cooperation. So maybe there will be more pandemics, and the World Health Organization will be beefed up. It may be that climate change gets to the point where the countries of the world decide they really have to do something about it. It may be that this has gotten out of control, and all those people who live close to the sea, they're going to have to be moving. There might be very large migrant flows. Who knows? The only thing we can say about the world in 50 years from now, in 2070, is that in some respects it's going to look like the world today, but in a lot of other respects it's going to look very different. But last thing I can say about it is that most of you will still be around to see. So it's going to be a great adventure going from here to there. And what we wind up with when we get there, well, I won't be around to see this, but you will.